Okay, now our speaker, Mr. Gary Glenn, is about to come up and talk to us here, tell you just a little bit about him, and then he's going to tell you some more about himself, I'm sure, as soon as I find my notes. There we go. I don't know why I need them. Mr. Glenn is the representative for the 98th District. Okay. He lives in Williams Township. Is that right? Okay, they got that right. He was, in 2015, he was voted the Freshman of the Year in the House. He's a very conservative representative. And that's all I'm going to tell you about him. He's going to tell you the rest of it. We're very happy to have him here. Please welcome Gary Glenn to speak to us.
Good to see you. Didn't mean to catch anybody off guard by showing up early. Came straight from Lansing. How's everybody tonight? Good. Went to a rally last night in Cairo, Trump Republicans. I think maybe they're probably going to do some down here along those lines as well. But we had pretty good turnout last night. And let me say, as I've said for the last 8 years, and I say this with all sincere conviction, thank God for the Tea Party movement. I was a speaker at the very first Tea Party rally we had with 600 people on the courthouse steps of Midland County, because my district straddles two counties, Midland County and Bay County. And somebody invited me to come down here and be a speaker at what may have been your first rally out at the courthouse at Lapeer County. So I was a speaker that day and did that all across the state in my capacity at that time as president of the American Family Association of Michigan. But I was also hired a contract in 2009 by an organization called Americans for Limited Government. They put me in charge of a group of young men, half a dozen all across the country. We assigned them various congressional districts, and their job was to go out and organize opposition to Obamacare's passage at that time. So spent several months trying to stop Obamacare, and the Tea Party worked closely with Tea Party movements all across the country in that regard, and we just came ever so close to stopping it. But did not. And in 2011, 2012, I was a candidate, felt I could not stand by and just watch what was happening to our country. And all the big-name politicians had said they didn't have the guts to get in the race against Debbie Stabenow, and the polls said she was, only at 41% approval. And there were a bunch of nobodies in the primary, and I figured maybe I could be the biggest nobody of all. And got in that primary, and then the very day I announced, Pete Hoekstra said he had changed his mind and got back in the race. So I thought to myself, okay, I just announced this morning. 6 hours later, Hoekstra announces he's in the race. I'll figure out a way in 2 to 3 weeks to gracefully fade away. And we were having our family prayers over the next several nights, and my then 13-year-old said something to this effect: Dad, just because the Lord put an obstacle in your way doesn't mean you're going to quit, does it? Where do you hear that kind of thing? And so I felt like, as a sense, I've got somebody watching. Maybe I'm supposed to set an example. I did. I went out and I gave talk. I found I was giving people hope that we did have a chance of pulling our country back from the brink of socialism, and so I just kept going. Ended up losing that primary, obviously. But in that process, you may recall that all the candidates came around and talked to the Tea Parties. They went through an elaborate process, had a big debate up in Central Michigan, with some 45 Tea Parties roughly participating. And I was the overwhelming choice. I think like 40 of the Tea Parties endorsed me, 2 or 3 endorsed one other guy, and then the third guy got one. So it wasn't a close call after they'd had the opportunity to vet me, hear me speak, answer questions, etc. So I don't ever go into a Tea Party organization, including the one up in my home country there between Midland and Auburn, asking for their support as an outsider, but as a Tea Party candidate, and always have been. One of the first things they teach you as a candidate, and I remember all the way back to Ted Kennedy running for president in 1980, because I was paying attention, and Roger Mudd was interviewing him and asked him why he was running for president, and he fumbled that question. And they said, boy, that's the most basic question you better be able to understand. So the purpose, I think, tonight's meeting is for you guys to get to know me a little bit better. Why am I running for state representative? Why might I run for something else in the near future? I searched my heart several years ago. Why am I the way I am? Why do I care so much? And I sincerely came up with this answer, that I was raised by a World War II Marine who survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's just part of my life story. My dad was a Marine, tough guy, survived Pearl Harbor. When you're a little kid and you learn that kind of thing about your dad's your hero. I was inspired by the movie Saving Private Ryan. Everybody, I suppose, has seen that. And I don't know if you knew, but the older actor who portrayed the old Private Ryan at the beginning and the end of the movie, who had taken his family back to Normandy, was a man from Bay City who just died in the last several years. I thought he kind of resembled my dad, but just the whole notion of going back to Normandy inspired me, and I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great to take my father back to Pearl Harbor? I didn't know it. He didn't know it, but it ended up being the last December he was alive. He was already kind of sick. My mom wasn't real happy about the notion. I'm going to put him on a plane, fly him halfway around the world, but he finally told her, I want you to go with me, but I'm going with you or without you. And I think if he'd known it was his last days on earth, that he wouldn't have missed going. The layout of the streets is the same. Marine Barracks is in the same place. So he was able to identify, and I stood there with him in the same spot, in the same street he remembered standing at age 19, shooting at Japanese airplanes with just a rifle. And his unit got a Presidential Unit Citation for taking down one Japanese airplane that they found with only rifle holes in the wings. We went out on the Arizona Memorial for the official commemoration service the morning of December 7th, 2002. My dad was allowed 2 seats. He left my wife and my mother ashore and took me. I wasn't sure that's what he was going to do, but I certainly was proud to go with him. Thought he might take my mom, but he asked me to go. And he sat right next to the commanding general of all Marines in Hawaii, and they had him wear a purple lei, which identified him as a survivor of that attack. There were only 18 there that day for that particular commemoration service. But what that meant was, because he had a purple lei on, that general, admirals, captains, lieutenants, everybody of every rank, saluted former Staff Sergeant James R. Glenn all day. If you've been in the military, especially if you've been in the Marines, you'll appreciate that he kind of grumbled to me under his breath at one point, I'm not supposed to return the salute because I'm not undercover, meaning he didn't have a hat on. I said, Daddy, you better return that general salute. And he did. The last thing we did that day was go find his best friend's grave. They had been out to a Charlie Chaplin movie on Saturday night. They both lived at Marine Barracks, but the next morning his best buddy from basic training, Robert Peake of Oklahoma, was assigned to guard duty on the USS Oklahoma. My dad had not been to that grave before, but I took a picture. He took one of the purple flowers off that lei and laid it on Robert Peake's grave. And I quickly calculated from the dates that Robert Peake was 17 years and 10 months old the morning that he gave his life in defense of our country. My father, at 19, was willing to give up all the days that he had thereafter to make sure that we had a free country. It was my father who taught me to love my country. Not just by his actions or by his words, but by the example of his life. Taught me to love my country. Taught me there was something special about America. Taught me to stand up for what I believe in. Fight for those I love. That's the answer that I came up with in my own heart as to why do I care so much? Why do I feel this sense of duty? We came perilously close last November, I think, to losing what we inherited from those who came before us. After 8 years of Obama's apology tour, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, I think we likely would have been given the United Socialist States of America. and don't know if we and our children would have ever gotten a free country back. But I do feel a sincere sense of duty to do whatever I can from whatever position I can to do my part. I know that's why you're here. I came away from the Republican National Convention convinced that Donald Trump, for example, loves our country, that he was sincere in his motivation. He just happens to be differently able than we are to do something about it, has his own jet, 100% name ID, billionaire. He could run for president. We can't do that. But if we have that same sense of duty, I think we're obligated. I think we have a patriotic duty to do whatever we can, wherever we can, to be courageous and not be afraid to stand up. And I actually took an oath twice. Once, when I became an Eagle Scout, I swore that I would do my best to do my duty to God and my country. And then about 20 years later, in the Gulf War buildup, I took another oath that I would uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I don't know about you, but I think the threats to our liberty come more from sources that are domestic these days than anybody outside the borders of our country. But I just feel obligated on behalf of my family, but on behalf of a country that I think is the most exceptional in the history of the world, to do whatever I can to make sure that my children, 5 children and 6 grandchildren, inherit from me what I was blessed to inherit from my father and mother and those who came before them, a free country. And I suspect that's why you're here tonight. Abraham Lincoln said that the Lord will carve the love of liberty onto your heart. So I'll tell you a story or two about me that would seem to indicate I had that love of liberty carved onto my heart, perhaps at an age so young I didn't even know how to describe it. But when we were in 4th grade, they took us on a field trip to a greenhouse at a local community college, and when we left, they gave every kid their own potted plant. And they challenged us to take the plant home, keep it alive over the winter, so that when we came back the next year, we could tell them if we kept it alive. And who knows what makes a difference? It's a big deal to a 9-year-old. I just remember thinking, hey, if nobody else keeps that thing alive, I'm going to keep it alive. I'm going to accept the challenge. I'm going to come back next year and say, I kept it alive. So I was already invested emotionally. And we got back to school, and Miss Hefner, the 4th grade teacher, said she decided she was going to put it to a vote of the class whether or not to donate the plants to be planted outside the principal's office. I was only 9 years old, but I immediately recognized this as an abuse of the eminent domain process by an arm of the government that was going to seize my private property for a public use without due compensation. Well, the truth is I didn't think any of those things. But instinctively, I thought that was wrong. I mean, my instincts were that we have fancy words for what was going on, but that was my instinct. This is not right. So I made a technical appeal. I said, the kids that ride the bus back and forth to school have already left. It's not fair. They don't get to vote. Well, she blew that off. Put it to a vote. I think I was the only kid that cared. I think I was the only kid that voted to keep our plants for ourselves. But I did convince my girlfriend, Lisa Jessup, after class, to go down to the principal's office with me and see Mr. Caldwell. And Mr. Caldwell was a high school football referee, so I saw him throughout the rest of my high school career on the football field and elsewhere. Played ball with his son. But at that time, I was 9 years old, and he was a grown man. And we waltzed into the principal's office, and I said, Mr. Caldwell, Lisa and I would like to take our plants home. And I can't explain why he reacted this way. He's a grown man, but he started finger pointing down at a couple of kids and said, if that's the way you feel about it, then we'll just make every kid take their plant home. And I remember thinking, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but I'm not going to argue with you. I just want to take our plants home. So they let us take our plants home. Next morning, we said the Pledge of Allegiance. And I was sitting right on the front row, right where you are, and Miss Hefner said, now, class, I want to talk to you about a concept called majority rule. And I rolled my eyes, and she said, Mr. Glenn, any more than that, and I'll meet you in the hall with a paddle. So I sat up straight, behaved. She lectured us about majority rule. But I got to take my plant home. And I figured that I would plant it under the dryer exhaust because that would keep it warm all winter. And I would be able to come back the next year and brag that I'd kept it alive. So I put it under the dryer exhaust. In about 3 days, it was burnt to a brown crisp. So in this free enterprise system that we're so blessed to have, you have the freedom to fail. And hopefully be smarter the next time because you learned something. So I burnt my plant to a crisp. I knew not to do that ever again. But one thing I didn't do is go back to the principal's office looking for a bailout, asking for somebody else's plant. Well, something was at work there just instinctively when I was 9 years old. Flash forward to my senior year in high school, and Governor Ronald Reagan was coming to town, running for president. And Jimmy Stewart was with him. And they told us over the loudspeaker that if you got your parents to sign a permission slip, you could skip class and go see a candidate for president of the United States. And I was paying attention. I loved that stuff about the Panama Canal. We built it. We paid for it. We're going to keep it. I was weird that way. I had spent the summer, I was 14, watching the Watergate hearings. Not every kid did that, I assure you. But I was paying attention. Cared about my country. Well, I said to myself, of course I'm going to go see Governor Reagan running for president. But I got to school the next morning and realized I'd forgotten to get my mom's permission. No big deal. It's not till this afternoon. I will call her at lunch. She will be happy to come down and sign a piece of paper for me. Between classes, I heard kids bragging about how they had forged their parents' signatures so they could go lie at the lake. I thought, well, that's kind of disgusting, but no skin off my nose. Until the principal came on the loudspeaker about 11 o'clock and said, because we've got so many kids got permission to go see Governor Reagan, we're not going to let anybody else go. Well, I was president of the Captain of Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I was an Eagle Scout, straight arrow type of guy. But I wasn't going to let a bunch of people lying so they could go lay out the lake keep me from being able to go see a candidate for president of the United States. So I just went. Had a great time. Reagan was good. Jimmy Stewart was funny. Good time. Came to school the next morning. They called my name over the loudspeaker. Will Gary Glenn please come down to the principal's office? And when I got there, my mother was sitting there. And that's a little embarrassing. I was a little ticked at that. You call my mother? They said they were thinking about suspending me for 3 days. And so I told Mr. Jessup, the assistant principal, I told him the story I did you about the kids bragging in the hall about lying about it. I said, if I had the same decision to make all over again, I'd do the exact same thing. I wasn't going to let kids lying about something keep me from being able to see a candidate for president of the United States. I did what I had to do. Now you do what you got to do. And I do believe out of the corner of my eye, my mother never said a word, but I do believe I saw her mouth turn up just a little bit, at this. And they backed off. I don't know why. They threatened me with 3 days suspension, but decided not to suspend me. But I was paying attention at an early age. That's the point of the stories. I remember that same year sitting in my dad's recliner reading a Reader's Digest article about a man in Louisiana who got killed on a job site because he was not a member of the union, but because he was a member of the wrong union. And it led to Louisiana passing a right-to-work law. The violence that had occurred motivated the governor and the legislature to make Louisiana, I think it was at that time, America's 20th right-to-work state. I remember thinking to myself, somebody ought to be out there doing something about that issue. Kind of caught me. Turns out 2 years later, I did an internship in my congressman's office in Washington, and while I was there, I went to a campaign training school for young people. And I had 2 job offers in the entire country, both in Idaho. I grew up in North Carolina, so 20 years in North Carolina, 20 years in Idaho. But both those job offers were in Idaho, and one of them was with the group that was trying to pass a right-to-work law in Idaho. So 2 years after I read that Reader's Digest article and said somebody ought to be out there doing something about that, I was out there doing something about that. 21, became executive director of the Idaho Freedom to Work Committee. That was the lobbying organization, and held that position for the next 6 or 7 years. They told me to go pass a right-to-work law. I thought they meant it. So we did. Over the course of 4 election cycles, we elected enough Republicans to override the Democratic governor's veto. And then, after we had overridden it, the unions got enough signatures to put it on the ballot, outspent us $3 million to $1 million, and we won anyway. On the simple principle of freedom, that an individual ought to be free to join an organization if he chooses to do so, and shouldn't be compelled to do so under threat of being discriminated against and losing his job. Convinced Charlton Heston to do a TV ad. I had heard a rumor that Charlton Heston, former Screen Actors Guild president, AFL-CIO, supported right-to-work legislation, so we called up his office, ended up going down to his house, filming a TV ad at his house, put it on the air. It was one of the most influential, in fact, according to the poll we did after the election, he was the single most influential personality on either side of the campaign. They'll talk about a pinch-me moment. Does anybody know the name Larry Reed? Larry was the first president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, but at that time he was living in Idaho. So he had a front row seat as I was running the campaign to pass a right-to-work law in Idaho. So Larry named me and Charlton Heston co-recipients of his organization's Freedom Fighter of the Year Award for 1986, the Center for the Study of Market Alternatives. And later, in April of 1987, I was in California on some business doing some fundraising for a conservative organization in Washington, and I called up Mr. Heston's secretary and I said, I got this plaque from that banquet that he couldn't be to because he was filming, I think, the Colbys at the time, and his secretary said, well, he'd be happy to have you bring it by. So, you know, I was there 45 minutes early, sitting in the driveway. Wasn't any way I was going to be late. I was sitting at attention the whole time, went in the living room with him. Big stick, you know, like that big stick that it was leaning up in the corner of the living room, and I kept an eye on it to make sure it didn't turn into a cobra and come slithering in my direction. There was this little gold statue on the end table right here. And I was extremely nervous and sucking down the Diet Coke or whatever I had to drink, and he'd jump up and refill it. But after we enjoyed telling some stories, I went and sat with him on the couch and showed him this poll. Because he kept saying, you fine people in Idaho did all the work. I was just happy to help. I said, Mr. Heston, look, this poll says you were the single most influential personality on either side of the campaign. However many years the Lord has left for you, I hope you will continue to speak out for what you believe in, because when you speak, you move people. He said, great, I'll put this in my library at UCLA. The pinch-me moment is that within 6 months he was doing stuff for the NRA and narrated a film for the National Right to Life Committee, The Silent Scream. The pinch-me moment is to think that there's any possibility that me sitting next to him on that couch showing him that poll might have had something to do with how he spent the rest of his life. Already wealthy, didn't have to go out and suffer the grief that he did for what he stood up for, but he was a patriot. And a month later, my first son was born, and his name is Heston David Glenn, who's now 30 years old and has 4 children of his own. I was also a founding board member of the Michigan Freedom to Work Coalition. Larry Reed moved back to Michigan, became president of the Mackinac Center for Public Policy, recruited me to follow him about 10 years after the right to work battle had been won in Idaho. So 20 years in North Carolina, 20 years in Idaho, and 20 years so far in Michigan. Actually got the award, the highest award from the National Right to Work Committee about 2 years ago, the Senator Everett B. Dirksen Award for a lifetime award for my work on that particular issue. After I had worked myself out of a job in Idaho running that campaign, I became executive vice president for the State Cattlemen's Association. So spent 2 or 3 years working on farm and ranch issues. Got elected to 2 terms as a county commissioner in Boise. And as a county commissioner in Boise, authored the first, what's now called a health savings account. We, at the time, called it a medical savings account. But I authored the first medical savings account plan for county employees anywhere in America. Jersey City had done it for city employees. We were the first county. The mayor of Jersey City and I testified before Congress. The committee chair considered us, they said, pioneers in free market health care reform, and wanted to use our plans as a model for national health care reform in the free market direction, not the direction that Obamacare took us. As I indicated, Larry Reed recruited me to come to the Mackinac Center for Public Policy to advance school choice, their universal tuition tax credit. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I became president of the American Family Association of Michigan, which is a pro-life, pro-family organization, and probably the thing of most significance, maybe the most significant thing I've done in my entire life of caring and trying to do my best to have an impact, was a Catholic law professor and I Pat Gillen from Ave Maria University, co-authored the Marriage Protection Amendment that was on our ballot in 2004 that was approved by about 60% of Michigan voters to define marriage as God ordained it between one man and one woman. And it took 5 justices of the United States Supreme Court to undo what we had accomplished. In 2014, the House of Representatives seat in my district was vacant, and I was elected. I was endorsed by the NRA, of which I am a life member. I was endorsed by Michigan Right to Life, been on the board of 2 other pro-life organizations, was endorsed by Farm Bureau and all the various conservative organizations that you would expect. In 2016, I was reelected with 60% of the vote, won 48 out of 50 precincts, and I lost the 2 remaining precincts by a combined total of 6 votes. And so after I won 55% the first time, 60% the second time. And without compromising my conservative principles. That's an important principle in and of itself, I think. I was given the award from the American Conservative Union, the Conservative Excellence Award, for having scored the most conservative voting record in the House of Representatives in my freshman term. I had a perfect 100% score with Americans for Prosperity and the National Federation of Independent Business. Served on military and veterans, commerce and trade, tax policy, insurance, and communications and technology committees over the last 3.5 years. And as Tim indicated, the press corps, because I think this is also an important element. The establishment politically tries to tell us, folks like us who believe like we do, that in order to be effective, you have to be willing to compromise your principles. Well, it's important to me, it's been one of my objectives, to prove that you can be both conservative and true to your values and convictions and effective. So on the one hand, I was given the award for having the most conservative voting record in the House, and the media corps that covers the state capitol voted me out of 55 first-term state senators and state representatives as the most effective first-term legislator in Lansing. So I mean it in all sincerity when I say that I was motivated to do that for folks like you. You know, to push back on that notion that the only way you can be effective in elected office is to compromise in the things we care so much about. I was vice chair of the Energy Committee the first year, and I'm chairman of the Energy Policy Committee this year. And I believe in restoring free market principles to our energy market. I think it applies in that market as it does in anywhere else. And as long as we have the highest electricity rates in the Midwest and 12th highest in the nation, Michigan is not going to be the job-creating juggernaut that we all ought to aspire toward it being. So I'm doing everything I can to protect that little sliver of the 10% of the current electricity market that allows you to choose to buy from somebody other than consumers and DTE, the 2 big monopolies. They tried to do away with even that little 10%, and remarkably we stopped them. But just to give you an example right here close to home, your local school districts are part of this electricity choice program. Now, not all of them, but Almont Schools has saved $303,000, Dryden saved $179,000, Imlay City $516,000, Lapeer Community Schools $866,000, and North Branch Schools $194,000 for a total of $2.06 million because they were free to buy their electricity from somebody other than DTE. DTE doesn't want the competition. And they tried mightily. In fact, they spent $10 million in lobbying and TV ads and campaign contributions in my freshman term with the governor, the House Energy Chair, and the Senate Energy Chair committed to eliminate that 10% choice market. And remarkably, we stopped them. And I was perceived as being the leader of the effort to stop them, even as a first-term legislator. As I said earlier, I'm a life member of the National Rifle Association, and I was the main sponsor of a package of constitutional carry legislation. You know you're free to carry a pistol on your hip just about anywhere in Michigan, but if you put your jacket on, you're breaking the law. So because of that, you got to pay a jacket tax. That's what it amounts to. Well, I introduced legislation to say that if you're otherwise qualified to own a gun and carry a gun, that you can do so with a jacket on or a jacket off. And it's one of the issues, and there are many, on which we are waiting for a new governor because he does not agree with us on that issue. But I think any of those from whom we have to choose in the next election, I think would be more likely to do so. It's my opinion that in a society where we have certain organizations encouraging civil unrest in our streets, and where even here at home we face a threat of terrorism, both foreign and domestic, that the more law-abiding American citizens armed to defend themselves, the better. I wish we were further along in getting this done, but I am the primary sponsor of legislation to eliminate Common Core in Michigan's public school system. Your state representative, Gary Howell, and I have partnered up on a piece of legislation to end any further enrollment. I think we ought to do away with it completely, but at minimum, quit digging the hole deeper to end any further enrollment as of the end of this fiscal year in the Obamacare implementation known as Medicaid expansion in the state of Michigan. It will not sustain itself with the numbers there are now, which is twice as many new registrants as they told us it would be when it first was passed by the legislature. And if it won't sustain itself now, we certainly shouldn't be continuing to put more and more people on the rolls. I voted against the gas tax increase. There weren't many of us who did, but I did. And I didn't just vote against the one that was passed by the legislature that became law. I was on TV on WNEM with Paul Mitchell on a panel. I was sitting with Paul as the two. We were debating against two people on the other side. We were the two debating against, what was it, Proposal 1, which the people of Michigan rejected by 80 to 20. And I'm pretty sure I checked, and in the area I represent and down here, it was even bigger, 85 to 15. So I stood with now Congressman Mitchell against that proposal. And I'm also a co-sponsor of a bill to repeal the senior citizen pension tax you might have heard about. And I want to give you an example because I would encourage you to aspire, even in whatever position you are. And certainly if I'm in a position where I got a title in front of my name in an office, I should be all the more responsible, not to be in any way timid, but to be bold in trying to make as big a difference as you can wherever you are. Can one person make a difference? Let me give you an example. I went out to California to spend time with my one son, who's a graduate of the Bay Area Net Career Center, who told me on his 23rd birthday he felt spiritually called to help man get back into space. Well, I recognize the notion of feeling spiritually called. I just had never heard that one. But he was diligent about it. He spent 6 months calling up NASA and SpaceX and Virgin Galactic, and with nothing more than a degree from Bay City Western and Bay Area Net Career Center, he is now a rocket instrumentation technician for Virgin Orbit. So he tests rockets that are going to put satellites into space. And he had to go to Tehachapi, California, which is where John Glenn and Yeager and all those guys tested the X-15 back in the day. But now, in order to be able to design them, he has to get his degree. So he's going to come back to Michigan next year, live in Michigan for a year, reestablish his residency, and go to the University of Michigan and get an aeronautical engineering degree. I was flying out to spend some time with him and his wife and our 3-year-old granddaughter, Mila. And as we flew across the country, was able to watch on Fox News the news report about that first terrorist attack in Paris. This is November of 2015. By the time I landed in California, I don't know if you remember, that Governor Snyder had the previous year said that he wanted Michigan to be the #1 place in America to bring Syrian refugees. Do you remember this? So I had watched on this Fox News coverage as Comey, FBI Director Comey, and the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee had said, we can't vet these people. We have no way of knowing who's safe and who's not. And so when I got out there, I sent an email to Governor Snyder. I said, Governor, I want you to rethink this position about saying we want to be the place you bring all those folks. I think you ought to be cautious until our security personnel can tell us we know which ones are or are not being sent to America to try and infiltrate our country to pose a threat to us and our families and our communities. You ought to back off, reverse yourself, and sent it to him and to the media. Because my purpose was not just to try to persuade him privately, but to call him to account publicly. Well, what do you think he did the next day? I was kind of surprised. He actually reversed himself. And stories all around the world, literally on the Associated Press and UPI and else, reported that this somebody nobody had ever heard of, Representative Gary Glenn, had that title. All of a sudden that meant I could maybe have an impact. This Representative Gary Glenn called on Rick Snyder to reverse himself, and the governor did. This is on Sunday. By Wednesday of that same week, 30 governors, Republican and Democrat, had joined him in that stand. If you're a willing vessel and not afraid to be bold to stand up for what your heart tells you and your convictions tell you are the right thing, and it ought to be a no-brainer that protecting the security of our people ought to be first and foremost in our duties as state officials, I think one person can have an impact. And I certainly aspire to do that. I've always felt a sense of duty to maximize my impact. I've been married for 34 years, have 5 kids, 6 grandkids. My last child left 5 months ago. My wife and I got a realtor, and we had a 5-child house, and now it's just the 2 of us. So we were looking around for a place to stay so I didn't have to cut grass anymore. I used to enjoy chopping wood, but between politics and a few health challenges, that 5 acres, we weren't enjoying it like we used to. Long before there was any discussion of any political implications, in fact, for about 2 months, my wife and I were out looking for a smaller place, long before there was any talk about any political implications as to where we might end up living. But we did find a nice place back in August. I would say in wrapping up my comments here before I submit myself to your questions and job interview perhaps, that what my big signs say that one of my supporters came up with was tested and trusted. I've got a depth of knowledge on a wide array of issues. I'm considered a national expert on labor law reform. The National Right to Work Committee would tell you that. Used to run around the country, including with ALEC, talking about free market health care reform when I was the county commissioner who had the first plan of a medical savings account of any county in the country. Spent 2 or 3 years working for an agricultural trade association, doubled its membership and its budget. It became the most high-profile ag organization in the state of Idaho when I was its director. Spent 8 years in the U.S. Army Guard and Reserves, honor graduate of both basic training and advanced individual training. The Mackinac Center recruited me to come promote school choice, the civil rights issue of this century, as they framed it, that every child, no matter where they live, ought to have an opportunity at a quality education and a safe education. A wide array of issues, a depth of knowledge, and who would have ever thought? I certainly didn't think that when I got elected to the legislature, and there were a lot of critics who, they thought they had an idea of what would be, my focus. But now I've become one of the most outspoken advocates for free market principles in our electricity market as chairman of the Energy Committee. So some degree of expertise. And it leaves me all the more with a sense of duty to serve. I'm 59 years old. And if I submit myself to a job interview, which tonight may end up being, if you pay attention for the next couple of weeks, you have a right, as my potential employer, to know some other things. Last January, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And I didn't realize at the time. My wife realized it a little quicker than I did as to just how much of a goner they thought I was. I mean, these technicians giving me these treatments, getting all teary-eyed and hugging me and stuff, ladies I didn't know, and I couldn't figure out, what are they? They just thought they were going through the motions. This thing had climbed up out of my prostate and had already destroyed the next to the last vertebrae in my spinal column. So it was stage 4, spread into the bones. Surgeon said, we'll have to put a titanium cage into your backbone to replace that destroyed vertebrae, and Annette joked that she wanted to be able to tell people that if you thought Gary had a backbone before, now it'll be titanium reinforced. They put me into a brace, told me not to exercise, not to lift anything more than 5 pounds, and I put on 55 pounds and 10 inches on my waist in 3 months. From the steroids and the drugs and all this other stuff and not being able to move, basically. At the Republican National Convention, I had to take a wheelchair. That's how bad it was a year ago, last summer. The last chemo treatment was the end of last July. My PSA score, guys, if you're familiar with that, it was 348 when they found out it was cancer. That's pretty high. At 4, you're in trouble, and it was 348. But a week later, it was 100. And my personal physician said that was a near miracle. 4 weeks after that, it was 1.1. Well, if it was a near miracle to go to 100, what was it to go to 1.1? It then went all the way down to less than 0.01. I would wager I got the best PSA score in the building right now. And so they said I went from stage 4 to remission in 5 weeks. Both of those were news stories, front page, top of the page banner headlines in the Midland paper, because if you're state rep and that happens to you, that's news. I thought the people had a right to know, but let me tell you the truth about why I put a news release out immediately without any thought. I knew my church would pray for me, because they'd know about it. But I also knew there'd be folks, maybe even some like you, that if you read about it, you might not have even met me, but maybe you'd heard of me, liked what I stood for. Somebody I'd never met would pray for me if they knew about it. And I was greedy. I wanted thousands of people praying. Somebody put a card in the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem with my name on it. A Catholic priest in Washington, D.C., because my niece is Catholic, did a mass in my name. And dozens of churches here in Michigan across the country send me letters, we're praying for you. So 348 to 0.01, that's pretty good. The doctors called me unusually responsive. I have another word that starts with an M that I prefer. In fact, I said in both of those articles on the front page, I figured if I'm going out, I'm going to go out preaching. I'm not going to be asking the Lord to save me and then be bashful about it. I said, I appreciate the stuff that the technicians and doctors are doing at Mid-Michigan and the University of Michigan Cancer Center. I said, but my ultimate hope's in the healing power of Jesus' name. So about 3 months ago, University of Michigan said, we consider your remission to be stable. We don't need to see you again until next summer. So that was good news. And over the 4 months that I was wearing that brace, waiting for it to heal up enough to have the surgery to put the titanium cage in, we watched on the x-rays and all these shiny white vertebrae and then a black hole where the vertebrae used to be, and then that last one that's the pointed one, the coccyx. And we watched for 4 months as little white splotches showed up in that black hole. And by the 4th month, the neurosurgeon said, take the brace off, work your way back into normal activity. I don't need to see you anymore. Now, I don't know if you've heard yet from Dr. Jim Hines, who's running for governor. Told that story last night, so every time I got a doctor in front of me, I ask him, do spinal vertebrae grow back out of nothing? The answer is no, but mine did. Chiropractor took an x-ray about a month ago. It's right there, and it wasn't a year and a half ago. So, all the more do I feel a sense of duty. I have, President Reagan felt, if you read what he wrote, that when he dodged, well, he didn't dodge the bullet, but when he did not die from the bullet, he felt like he had been preserved for some cause. I can't help but feel the same thing. I feel blessed. I take account of my blessings. My only daughter got engaged last Saturday. I'd gotten a call a couple of weeks ago at 4 o'clock in the morning. She told me it was going to come at 4 o'clock in the morning because it was 10 o'clock Hawaii time, where this Army infantry sergeant had just gotten to come back from training on the Big Island. And so he called me at 4 o'clock in the morning, Michigan time. She told me, Dad, now he's not calling to ask your permission, but we want your blessing. So Alejandro Raul Rios called, NCO, to ask my blessing. And I trust my daughter's judgment, and I'd talked to him enough. I said, I joke about having an AR-15 and 2 shotguns, but I said the only thing that governs your behavior 4,000 miles away from my daughter's father is your character. And I appreciate the way she tells me you've treated her. So my daughter, he's going to get deployed to South Korea in February. They're going to get married in January. So I feel blessed that I'm going to be around to see my daughter get married, Lord willing. I think Speaker Leonard told the story when we were here a month or so ago. And he told it again up on Mackinac Island. They asked him, what's your favorite political story that has nothing to do with an issue? He and his wife had been told they couldn't have children. And then right after I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, they found out from their doctor his wife's pregnant. he tells me about this, and at a point when we weren't sure what the outcome was going to be for me, I said, well, Tom, I hope I'm still around 7 months from now to hold your new baby. And he said, Gary, I'm sure the Lord's going to keep you around when it happens. We'll take a picture of you and the baby on the house floor, and it'll be our miracle photo, our miracle baby and your miracle of surviving stage 4 cancer. That photo happened. In fact, it's happened now 3 times. And the last one, Hannah, her eyes were like this, like if I have to get my picture taken with this guy one more time. But anyway, I certainly do feel blessed and feel all the more sense of duty. I've always felt motivated to use the skills and talents and experiences with which the Lord has blessed me to try and have the maximum impact for the things you and I believe in and care about so much. You could ask my children, my constant prayer is, Lord, I'm a willing vessel. Make me an effective instrument. Don't let me waste what you've given me. Make me an effective instrument. And I will confess, after the experience of the last 18 months, to also having now perhaps a more conscious sense of urgency. Have as much impact as I can, as fast as I can. So in that spirit, I look forward to joining with you in preserving for our children and grandchildren, our posterity, the blessings of liberty, the blessings of a free country. And I'm so glad that you're just still meeting. So many of the other Tea Party meetings have kind of faded away. So I commend Tim and other leaders and you for continuing to be involved and remain committed to those constitutional principles and preserving this, what I think Ronald Reagan called the last best hope of mankind on earth. So God bless and keep you strong. If I haven't wasted all the time you had allocated, I will stand for questions. I'll be the last guy out of here. So I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Hello, how are you, Gary? 2 issues I want you to address. One is the insurance issue that's come up, the House Speaker is proposing. And the second one is the gerrymandering issue that's also going on in Michigan, but it's also before the United States Supreme Court from a Wisconsin case on those things. I'd like your comments on that, please.
I'm on the insurance committee. We had a hearing on the no-fault reform issue today. And I think there's a shot. We think that we'll have about 40 Republican votes, which means you can't pass it unless you get Democrat votes as well. But the mayor of Detroit is supportive of the same package that Speaker Leonard has put forth. And what it includes, that no prior reform package that I'm aware of includes, is a mandatory, by law, reduction in rates. So they calculate that your average reduction in the amount that you pay for car insurance, which right now is not just highest in the nation, it's 20% higher than number 2, Louisiana. But the average, they think, would be 20% if you are either 62 and above and have a health retirement plan, or if you're eligible for Medicare, they estimate it'll be 50% savings on your car insurance. We are the only state in America where you can't use Medicare if you're in a car wreck. Every other state can, but under the federal regs, Medicare can't be second to something else. And in Michigan, the catastrophic coverage is always number 1, so you can't use Medicare, which means you've paid in Medicare system, all this kind of thing, and then you can't use it, plus you have to pay $1,000 or $2,000 or however much it is for the catastrophic coverage. And what this new proposal would provide is there would be, if you wanted to continue to pay for the unlimited catastrophic coverage that Michigan's the only state in the country that has. You can continue to do that at the price, whatever it is. You could also get a $500,000 cap. You could also get a $250,000 cap and have the choice. So it's up to you. That's also in this new plan. And then it also would cap at 125% of workers' comp what you could be charged, because you're all familiar with it. I was in the doctor's office more in the last 18 months than I ever had any interest in being. They always ask you the same question, were you in a car wreck? Well, they knew I was in there for cancer, but they asked me every time, or were you in a car wreck? No. The reason they ask you that is because they will charge you differently. You know, an MRI might cost $600 if you run into a tree out skiing or snowmobiling. But if it happened in a car wreck, it's like $3,500. I mean, it's outlandish. So there would be a cap on the ability to continue to charge you multiples over and over again. I think it's got a better chance. Of course, they've been trying for 30 years to reform this and have never been able to thread the needle. I think we got a chance, but there's no guarantee. Okay. And the other one was gerrymandering. Right. The notion that you can have a nonpartisan citizen panel to draw legislative lines, I think is unrealistic, because I've watched states where they have one of those type things, and you always end up with even if they're just average Joe, a Republican, Democrat, somebody else, it's still partisan. And I look at the complaints about Michigan's reapportionment plan, and as recently as 2006, the Democrats had a 65-45 advantage in the State House of Representatives. In 2010, it went to 63-47 Republican under the exact same reapportionment plan. So which way was it gerrymandered? Was it gerrymandered for the Republicans or the Democrats? I mean, each party took turns overwhelmingly winning a majority in the House under the exact same plan. That suggests to me that maybe it's not gerrymandered, but it's responsive. You know, it allows for our elected officials to reflect the mood of the people. So I'm not real enthusiastic about it being turned over to some non-party. You know, it's all the liberals that are pushing this thing to take it away from the legislature. But if it's the legislature that's doing it, then they're accountable to you, and you can unelect them. If you have some appointed citizen panel, they're not accountable to anybody. So I'm not really enthusiastic about any significant reform in that regard. I think the way the system is now, the people that you elect draw the plans.
You know that there is a United States Supreme Court case pending.
Oh, there have been lots of them over the years that involved race and that kind of thing. And
right. But that one in particular is from Wisconsin, dealing with I think a citizen's apportionment plan. So I'm just curious. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned medical savings accounts.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Millie Sell.
Hello, Millie.
Is there anything going on about medical savings accounts in Michigan? I really support that because of what's been going on with Obamacare and these high deductibles that people can't afford. I mean, it's like no insurance at all. I think that if we have medical savings accounts and you start putting into it, I don't think you should be punished in any way because you're using it.
I agree.
And if they do that, I think eventually, in the future, we'll all be responsible for our own care to some degree, and we'll have to accept if we did not save enough.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with you. In the mid-1990s, I went around the country preaching that same message. And let me tell you how bad it was back then, because now you can get a medical savings account, or it's called a health savings account in Michigan. It's legal. Everybody sells them. In the 90s, they hardly existed anywhere. Blue Cross Blue Shield was out vigorously opposing them because they would have less power if you had more choice about how you conducted your health care. And at the time, if you put money into the medical savings account from your employer, you had to pay income tax on it. It was only under the George W. Bush administration that was eliminated, and we treated health savings accounts on an equal playing field with all other kinds of employer-provided insurance. They're not being taxed. But beforehand, they taxed the income that went into your MSA. The one that I designed for our county would have saved the county, I can't remember how much it was like $70,000 a year with 150 enrollees. And it wasn't mandatory. It wasn't the only thing. But 150 employees chose it, and I think maybe it was $90,000 in savings. So it was cheaper for the taxpayer, number one, which should be my primary motivation. As an elected official representing everybody, that should be my primary motivation. But it also was better for me as a county commissioner. I took the medical savings account because if I don't use it, it's mine to keep. That's the other unique thing about it, and it rolls over like a second IRA, tax-free, and when I get to 59 and a half, I can use it for whatever I want. So it was better for me. Also, the maximum out-of-pocket risk was dramatically better. Under the old $100 deductible 80/20 copay we used to have, if my wife and I and the 4 children at the time were in a car wreck and we were all hurt and we all met the deductible, or all got sick at the same time with something serious, the maximum out-of-pocket risk we had under the old plan was $5,300, something like that. The $100 deductible plus the 20% copay above the deductible. And under the plan that I had designed, the maximum out-of-pocket risk that we would ever face would be $900 because we had a $3,000 deductible, and then the county deposited $2,100 a year into the MSA. And it was 100% coverage above the $3,000 deductible. And since they were giving me $2,100 in cash every year, the maximum I'd ever have to pay out of my own pocket is $900. And 90% of all MSA holders don't spend everything in their account every year. They don't need it all, which means in the second, third, and fourth years, I might have no out-of-pocket risk if someone has rolled over and they give me another $2,100. So it's cheaper for the taxpayers. It was better for me as the insured. And because if I didn't spend it, I got to keep it, what did I care about? What did I care about that a lot of people don't care about in terms of health care? If you've got an employer-provided health care policy where somebody else is paying the bill, either the government or your employer, do you care what health care costs? Because the insurance is covering it either way. But if it's my money and I get to keep it, and at age 59 and a half, use it whatever I want if I don't spend it, well, all of a sudden I care what health care costs. My wife would call around. We practiced what we preached, and there was some test we wanted to get one time, and she found it as big a disparity as $600 to $1,500. Which one do you think we took? $600. And if everybody had an MSA and everybody was calling up doctors saying, what does it cost? What do you think would happen to the cost of health care? If the American people cared what health care costs, but most don't. Plastic surgery and LASIK are not covered by insurance. You know what has happened to the cost of those 2 procedures? Dramatically declined, while otherwise the cost of health care is the sharpest increase of anything going on in our economy. Second only to that is college tuition, because they all know if we raise tuition, government will just write bigger checks. And if we raise the cost of health care, the insurance company or the government will just write bigger checks. But on 2 things that the government and private insurance don't cover, the prices come down. The free market works, competition works, choice works. So I think it's what we ought to have for everybody. I think that is the solution. It's a major part of the solution for the Republican health care plan. It was to repeal Obamacare, and a major element of it was to have health savings accounts. But obviously they haven't been able to get it done in Washington, to our great disappointment. But I'm a big fan. I have a website. It's easy. It's Gary Glenn, and that's with 2 N's, garyglenn.us. If you look it up now, it says Glenn for Representative. I'm not going to make any announcements tonight, but that might change in a couple of weeks. But right now it says garyglenn.us. Look it up. You can see all about my background and what other people have said about me and things that news stories that have talked about me. But I certainly appreciate your attention tonight. I appreciate your letting me come talk to you. I obviously am not from Lapeer County. If that's the most important consideration for you, then nothing I said here tonight is going to make any difference. But I think it's where a candidate stands on the issues you care about that ought to count most. And so in that spirit, thank you. As I said, God bless you and keep you strong. Look forward to standing alongside of you to fight for the things we believe in.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Will you stay until the end of the meeting, so if they have any more questions, you can do it. I appreciate that. Okay. Well, that was nice. We're not going to have a postcard project tonight. We're going to have the drawing in a few minutes, but right now we happen to have a gentleman here who represents our senator, Senator Green. And we'd like to know what Senator Green is doing and how he's thinking. And here's Mr. McCleskey. Give a hand, please.
Sounds a little bit like a TV announcer, Johnny Donovan, when he says that. So thank you, Tim, for that very good introduction. Before we get started, I want to thank a particular news media professional who is with us tonight. Some of you hopefully know Andrew from the Lapeer County Press. We in Tuscola County will take 92% credit for training Andrew, because he used to be the editor of the Tuscola County Advertiser. As a former member of the news media myself, sometimes we tend to be a little bit critical about the news media when it comes to covering Tea Party activities. And I am very proud that Andrew is here tonight. I don't know if we're going to see him 100% of the time, but I think we probably owe Tim some thanks and some of you for reaching out to our news media and letting them know what the Tea Party is really all about and trying to get rid of some of those not so accurate assumptions that certain people make. I also want to tell a quick story about Representative Glenn. He and I attended a public hearing in Bay County about a month ago. There was a certain utility company, I will not mention them by name, but sometimes they go by 3 initials, and they wanted to get some input from that particular township on this proposed wind energy project or farm. They did not like the format of the meeting, so they sent a letter and said, we're not going to be here tonight, but we're going to have some follow-up meetings, and we'll be happy to get input from the public. We probably had, from that township, maybe 15 or 20 speakers. And Gary talked about 2 words, trusted and tested. And it's good when we hear people like Gary and people like Mike talk about what they're doing. But in my humble opinion, sometimes you get a better idea when you talk with constituents, whether it's in Gary's district or Mike's district, you name it. And at this public hearing, I think there were at least 5 people who primarily talked about their concerns about wind energy. But when they had the microphone, they took the opportunity to thank Gary Glenn for his involvement getting FEMA involved with some of the flooding that took place in Bay County and Midland County. So at a public meeting, you don't really expect constituents to kind of go on a limb and thank an elected official, but that was kind of impressive. So thank you, Gary, for calling up, I think, the Lieutenant Governor in that regard. I've got 2 items that I want to cover tonight because I knew that Representative Glenn would steal most of my thunder. First part is a little bit of true confession. And if you want, you can raise your hand. If you just want to answer silently, that's fine. But I would like to know, is there anybody here tonight who has a CPL license and for some reason they forgot to renew their license in a timely fashion? Do I have any people who would be willing? Tim, you would confess to that? Yeah. Do you know what potential penalty under the current law you would have received? Yep. Right now we have in the House, and I think it's already been approved, it's on its way to the Senate, House Bill 4458. This was introduced by Representative Shane Hernandez from Port Huron. Right now, CPL holders currently face a possibility of a 5-year felony if they are found in possession of a concealed pistol, even if it's just 1 day after their license expires. This legislation, which I think did get bipartisan support in the House, we're hoping it will be bipartisan in the Senate as well, would create a 6-month so-called grace period after the license expires where people who remain eligible for CPL would be subject to a $330 fine if found to be carrying a concealed pistol. The fine can also be waived if the individual receives a renewal license within 60 days of the violation. I wish I could give you more information about the person who was kind of the subject of this legislation, but it was somebody, I think, just a little bit to the east of here. He was relatively young. He had quite a bit of, I think, student debt that he had accumulated going to college or university. And apparently when he got this charge against him, his life really went downhill. Sometimes we talk about that deck of cards. If it's just one card, it's not a big deal. But in this particular case, it really caused some problems. They were hoping that he was going to be able to testify before the House, but I think because of just the real negative impact, that was not possible. But I am cautiously optimistic that Mike and some of our senators will continue the bipartisan support, and just keep your eye on House Bill 4458. Feel free to call Mike's office if you support it. I'm 99.9% sure that Mike is definitely supporting this one. He has always been a proud supporter of the Second Amendment. Last item, sometimes I like to pretend that I am Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. We like to have our vocabulary word of the day. And our word for today is overzealous. According to Andrew, that is an adjective. If you were to think of some part of state of Michigan government that meets the criteria for being overzealous, what State Department would immediately come to your mind? Do I hear any answers? 3 letters? Or DEQ at the state level. Quite a few of our senators, all of them I think are Republicans, have sent a letter to the governor basically saying we have had enough of the DEQ being overzealous. I don't know this for a fact, but I know there's a major employer in our district. They made a big deal of it, I think, about a month ago, and in certain cases there are fines $10,000 a day. And, we don't expect the DEQ to be, the Chamber of Commerce, but this is part of the wording in the letter. It says, while we can appreciate the role of the DEQ, we see a pattern of unreasonable overreach when it comes to implementation and enforcement of laws and regulations that is alarming, and it seems that this concern has become more evident over the past couple of years. It is not representative of the customer service mindset that you established for the departments. I don't know for sure how much clout the governor has with the DEQ. I believe he appoints the director, so I'm sure that some discussions have gone on. When you have that many senators co-authoring a letter, I think that carries quite a bit of clout. And if people like us call up Mike, call up Gary, call up the governor, say, we agree with the Republican senators, we need to remove the adjective. What was that vocabulary word again, everybody? Overzealous. We need to remove that from the DEQ vernacular, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So, Jim, I think that's all I've got for tonight, but thank you for being a good listening audience as always.